The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet suburban street, the kind of neighborhood where parents felt safe sending their kids to school without a second thought. The elementary school sat at the corner, its gates just beginning to open. As children poured out, their laughter and chatter filling the air, moms and dads stood in small clusters, waiting to collect their little ones, while school buses lined up along the curb, their engines humming. Across the street, a woman in her mid-30s walked with an air of quiet confidence. Her long dark hair was pulled into a sleek ponytail, and she wore a simple but elegant blouse, tucked into fitted jeans. There was nothing particularly striking about her appearance at first glance, but there was something about the way she carried herself, shoulders squared, eyes sharp, that suggested she was no ordinary person. She had the kind of presence that made people take a second look, even if they couldn't quite place why. As she approached the school, her attention was drawn to a commotion near the entrance. A police officer, tall and broad-shouldered, stood, with his back straight, his uniform crisp, and his face twisted into something that looked dangerously close to rage. In front of him, a young teenage boy, no older than 14, stood frozen in place, his backpack hanging off one shoulder. The kid's face was a mixture of fear and defiance, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The woman's pace slowed, her gaze locking onto the officer. She didn't know what had happened, but the way the man was towering over the boy, the barely restrained aggression in his posture, sent a warning signal straight to her gut. Then it happened. Without warning, the officer grabbed the boy's arm, yanking him forward. The kid let out a yelp of pain, stumbling to keep his balance. Parents nearby gasped, some stepping forward hesitantly, but stopping short, unsure of what to do. No one wanted to get involved, not with the way this officer looked, like he was spoiling for a fight. The woman, however, didn't hesitate. She strode forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs around her. "Let him go!" The officer barely spared her a glance. "Ma'am, step back." She didn't move. "He's just a kid. This is police business. Step back." His tone was sharp, clipped, but there was an edge of irritation beneath it. The teenager's breath hitched, his eyes darting toward the woman. He didn't know who she was, but something in the way she stood made him feel like, maybe, for the first time since this nightmare started, he wasn't alone. The officer tightened his grip on the boy's arm, his knuckles going white. The kid winced, biting his lip to keep from crying out. "I said, let him go." The woman's voice was calm, but firm, each word carrying weight, and that's when the officer snapped. With a sudden, violent motion, he let go of the boy and turned toward the woman, his hand shot forward, his palm pressing against her shoulder as he shoved her back. "Step back," he growled. The crowd let out a collective gasp. A second of silence stretched between them. Then, the woman lifted her chin, her dark eyes locking onto his. "I dare you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something about the way she said it made the officer's face darken. His jaw clenched, his nostrils flared, his hands curled into fists at his sides. And then, before anyone could stop him, his fist flew. The impact was swift and brutal. The woman's head snapped to the side, her body staggering from the force of the blow. Gasps turned into screams as people rushed forward, some pulling out their phones, recording every second of what had just happened. The officer took a step back, his breathing heavy, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and something else, something uncertain, and then the woman straightened, slowly, deliberately. She lifted a hand to her face, touching her jaw where his fist had connected. A faint trace of blood stained the corner of her mouth, but her expression remained eerily calm. The officer opened his mouth, about to bark some sort of justification, but then he saw it. The look in her eyes. It was then that it hit him. Something wasn't right. Something was very, very wrong. Because in that moment, the crowd wasn't just staring at him with shock and outrage. They were staring at her with recognition, and then someone whispered it. A name that changed everything, and the officer's blood ran cold. The officer's heartbeat pounded in his ears. The whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd, a murmur that grew louder with each passing second. Parents, teachers, and even students who had been watching from the school gates were now wide-eyed, their phones capturing every detail. His pulse raced as he took a step back, his fingers still curled into a tight fist, his knuckles stinging from the impact. The woman wiped the corner of her mouth with the back of her hand, smearing away the trace of blood. Her expression remained unreadable. No fear, no anger, just a steady, unsettling calm that made the officer feel like he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Then someone in the crowd finally said it, loud enough for him to hear. "That's her! That's..." The name that followed hit him like a freight train. His stomach dropped. His vision tunneled. He knew the name. Everyone did. The woman before him wasn't just some random civilian stepping in where she didn't belong. She wasn't just a concerned bystander. She was someone powerful. Someone who should have never been touched, let alone struck. And now the weight of his mistake settled on him like a crushing force. The boy, still clutching his arm where the officer had grabbed him, looked between the woman and the cop, confusion flickering across his face. He had no idea who she was either, but he could see the fear creeping into the officer's posture. Just minutes ago, this man had been brimming with unchecked authority, flexing his power over a scared teenager. Now, he looked like he wanted to disappear. The woman took a slow step forward, her voice steady, but sharp enough to cut through the rising chaos. "You hit me," she said. Not a question, a statement. The officer swallowed hard. His training had prepared him for all kinds of situations, but nothing like this. His eyes darted to the people recording, to the school where teachers were beginning to step outside, their expressions a mix of shock and anger. He had never cared much about being filmed before. He had always felt untouchable, but this was different. She tilted her head slightly, studying him the way a hunter might study prey. "Do you even realize what you've done?" He opened his mouth, searching for an excuse, an explanation, anything that could fix what was unraveling in front of him. But nothing came out, and then the sirens. Distant at first, but growing louder. Someone had called for backup. Maybe a parent, maybe a teacher, maybe someone in the crowd who recognized her before he did. The officer instinctively reached for his radio, but his hand was shaking. His entire body was. Then, another voice cut through the tension. "Mom!" The boy. The woman turned, her eyes softening for the first time since the incident began. The teenager looked up at her, realization dawning in his features. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I'm here," she said quietly. The crowd erupted with murmurs again, the weight of the moment hitting them all at once. The officer's knees felt weak. He had no idea, no clue that the woman he had just struck was connected to the very kid he had been harassing. He had walked into this situation with his usual arrogance, assuming he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. But now, with the entire scene unfolding, it was becoming painfully clear that there were consequences. Heavy ones. The sirens were almost upon them. Flashing lights reflected off the school's glass windows. The woman straightened, lifting her chin, Her composure was unshaken, her authority undeniable. "You thought you could do whatever you wanted," she said, her voice unwavering. "You thought no one would stop you, that no one would care, that you could hurt people and walk away like you always do." The officer couldn't breathe, but not this time. The moment stretched, unbearably tense, as the police cars finally pulled up, and then the doors swung open. The police cars came to a sharp stop, their lights flashing red and blue across the stunned faces in the crowd. Officers stepped out quickly, scanning the scene, their hands resting near their belts, not yet drawing weapons, but clearly on high, alert. They had been called for backup, expecting a routine situation, maybe a minor disturbance, maybe a civilian resisting. What they saw instead made them pause. One officer, a sergeant with years of experience written across his lined face, caught sight of the woman standing tall in front of the man who had just struck her. His expression shifted instantly. His eyes widened as recognition set in. "Ma'am," he breathed, barely above a whisper. He turned to the officer responsible, his gaze darkening. "What the hell have you done?" The younger officer, the one who had thrown the punch, finally spoke. His voice cracked slightly, the bravado gone. I didn't know who she was." The woman gave a slow, measured nod. "And that," she said, "is exactly the problem." A murmur rippled through the crowd, people nodding, whispering. The sergeant took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, are you okay?" She glanced at the boy beside her, her son, then at the people watching, the children who had witnessed everything, the parents who had hesitated to intervene. She took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. "I'm fine," she said, though there was an edge to her voice that suggested otherwise. The officer who had hit her tried to straighten his posture, desperate to regain control of a situation that had spiraled out of his hands. "Look, I was handling a situation. I thought she was interfering. I didn't know." The sergeant cut him off sharply. "You didn't need to know." The younger officer's mouth opened, then closed. The weight of those words sank in. It shouldn't have mattered who she was. It shouldn't have taken recognition, a name, status, or power to make him second-guess his actions. Because the truth was, if she had been anyone else, just another woman, just another mother, just another person, he wouldn't have hesitated. And that was the real problem. The silence was suffocating. Then the woman finally spoke again, her voice steady. "You thought you could act without consequence, that no one would question you, that the badge gave you power without accountability." She tilted her head slightly, watching as the man shrank under her gaze. But now, the world is watching. The officer's hands twitched at his sides. The cameras were still rolling. His own colleagues were standing right there, waiting for a decision. The sergeant nodded slowly, then turned to the officer. "Hand over your badge." The color drained from his face. "Wait, what?" "You assaulted a civilian, on camera, in front of witnesses, and you're still standing here trying to justify it?" The sergeant's voice was calm, but firm. "You don't belong in this uniform." A stunned hush fell over the crowd. The officer looked around, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He wanted to argue, to fight back, to insist that he had been doing his job. But deep down, he knew, the moment his fist had connected, the moment he let his anger take control instead of his judgment, he had sealed his own fate. With shaky fingers, he reached for the badge pinned to his chest, unfastened it, and handed it over. The sergeant took it without a word. A slow murmur of approval swept through the crowd. Justice wasn't always this immediate, this clear-cut. But today, People had seen it happen. Today, there had been accountability. The woman exhaled, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. She looked down at her son, who was still staring at the scene, still processing everything that had happened. She knelt in front of him, her hands resting gently on his arms. "Are you okay?" The boy hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Yeah," he said softly. "Are you?" She smiled, just a little. "Yeah." And for the first time since this nightmare started, it felt like the truth. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, as the police cars remained parked, but no longer felt like a looming threat, she stood and took her son's hand. Together, they turned and walked away, leaving behind the chaos, the cameras, the murmurs of shock and satisfaction, because now the world knew the truth, and that was enough.